Hey folks, tonight we're diving into the surprisingly tough and downright miserable lives of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, against all odds, tried to survive some of the coldest, harshest nights in history, from makeshift insulation hacks to group sleeping strategies. Their story is all about grit, cleverness, and stubbornness. So, before you get comfy, take a sec to like and subscribe, only if you actually enjoy what I'm dishing out here. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Always cool to see folks tuning in from all over the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some white noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. When you think medieval life, you probably picture knights jousting, grand feasts, and fairs. But for the average peasant, winter wasn't a festival. It was a nightly battle of how the heck am I not dead yet? It wasn't just a season. It was a yearly endurance test run by a particularly sadistic teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Imagine this. You're stuck in a tiny hut made of mud and sticks, with walls so thin you can hear birds sneezing outside. No insulation, no windows, unless you count a tiny hole stuffed with animal hide, and definitely no temperature wars with your siblings. The inside temperature was usually just a few degrees warmer than outside, so if it was freezing out there, inside was just less freezing. Congrats. Nighttime was the absolute worst. Darkness swallowed everything whole. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fireplace sputtered pathetically, trying its best but mostly just singeing anyone unlucky enough to sit nearby. If you were stuck on the other side of the room, sorry buddy, you might as well be camping outside with worse snacks. Clothes didn't help much either. Peasants didn't rock fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets. You had a few scratchy wool layers, maybe a weird-smelling goat cloak, and hoped piling on layers would turn you into a human onion. Spoiler, it didn't work. Forget snuggling under soft blankets. Beds were usually sacks stuffed with dry grass or straw, maybe some old reed thrown in for good measure, plus a sprinkle of fleas for company. Luxury-defined medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Frostbite, hypothermia, and freezing deaths were constant threats, especially for kids and the elderly. Waking up breathing was considered a small miracle and definitely cause for celebration. Maybe with some frozen turnips for breakfast. Yeah, surviving a medieval winter wasn't fun. It was gritting your teeth, piling on every scrap of fabric you owned, huddling by the livestock, and praying you wouldn't wake up with icicles hanging from your eyebrows. And that's just the warm-up act. If you think your apartment has drafts because the window won't shut right, medieval peasants want to have a word. Their homes didn't just have drafts. They were basically enthusiastic wind tunnels with roofs. Most peasant houses were what historians politely call wattle and daub. Translation sticks, crisscrossed like a giant basket, smeared with a charming mix of mud, straw, and animal poop. Yep, poop. Not trying to be rude, on purpose poop was cheap. Sticky insulation, plus it was always on hand, so to speak. No matter how carefully the walls were whitewashed, they weren't winning any battles against a real winter storm. Cold wind found every crack and crevice, danced through the one-room homes, spun around, and made sure you never felt too cozy. Privacy? Nope. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Absolutely. Then there were the roofs. Those thatched roofs looked picturesque, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally invited local wildlife inside. a charming mix of mud, straw, and animal poop. Yep, poop. Not trying to be rude here. Poop is cheap, sticky insulation. Plus, it's always on hand, so to speak, no matter how carefully you whitewash these walls. They're not winning any awards for keeping out a real winter storm. Cold winds find every crack, every gap, and gleefully dance through these one-room houses, swirling around to make sure you never get too cozy. Privacy, forget about it. Warmth, not so much. Personality building, absolutely. Then there's the roof. Those thatched roofs look picture perfect until a few months of rain and snow sag them down, leak like a sieve, and occasionally let local wildlife crash your dinner party. Nothing says nice evening like a squirrel falling into your soup. Windows, if you're lucky enough to have them, are tiny and usually covered with thin animal hide or wooden shutters. Glass is so pricey that even the lord of the manor can't afford a pane or two, and neither can the peasants. They just pray the wind doesn't rip the cowhide off the walls during a blizzard. Floors, even worse, were usually just packed dirt. When it rained or snowed a lot, the mud would seep up through the floor, so technically, you could say they had indoor plumbing. Not that they were thrilled about it. In winter, every step inside felt like slogging through a frozen swamp. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from the inside. A triple threat on your body temperature. But medieval peasants weren't big whiners. They stuffed gaps with moss, shoved old rags into the draftiest spots, and huddled close together. The human version of insulation, creativity, stubbornness, and a bit of sheep fat smeared on the walls were usually the only things standing between them and turning into medieval popsicles, because if your house was falling apart and your best weather defense was mud and goat hair, at least you could laugh about it, just like your teeth not clashing together too hard, as if the freezing air wasn't enough. Medieval peasants also had to fight a sneaky enemy rising up from below, the frozen ground itself. Back then, floors weren't really floors. They were just patches of slightly flatter dirt inside your house. If you were lucky, someone might throw down some straw or old reeds to make it a bit comfier. But don't get it twisted. You were sleeping soundly, far away from the cold, hard earth, and oh, that cold was merciless. It seeped up from the ground like some evil little ghost sneaking through the straw straight into your bones and soul. If you dropped anything on the floor on a winter night, congrats. It was now part of the frozen dirt layer. Medieval peasants tried to fight this brutal battle in a few ways. One was spreading thick layers of straw on the floor if you could afford it, or more realistically, if you could steal enough wood from your neighbor's field without getting caught. You might get decent insulation, but straw got flattened fast. Mold came even faster, and it added a crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Some houses scattered dry reeds on the dirt. Occasionally, they'd pile fresh grass on top without clearing out the old stuff. Over time, this created a lovely little ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mysterious critters decided to move in. Basically, it was like medieval carpet padding if your carpet was alive, damp, and smelled like a wet dog for those with beds. That didn't solve much. They were usually just wooden frames stuffed with straw or dry grass. Guess what? Instead of cozy mattresses, you had stiff, shifting, crunchy pads that did nothing to block the cold seeping. Up from below, tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body solid. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the frozen ground, but learned to live uncomfortably on it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you managed that, you were doing better than most. If medieval houses had one hero in winter, it wasn't the roof, the walls, or even the thick dirt and insulation. It was the fireplace, a stubborn little fire pit, the only defense against cold, darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. In the center of nearly every peasant's house, there was a simple flame. No fancy stone hearths, no neat chimneys blowing smoke into the sky. Instead, you just had a hole or a pile of rocks, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke flooding the room to make you wonder if you were slowly turning into an idiot. Yep, most houses didn't even have. If there's one hero of winter, it's not the roof, the walls, or even the thick mud insulation. It's the hearth, a stubborn little fire pit crackling away, the only defense against cold, darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. At the center of almost every peasant's home is a simple fire. No fancy stone fireplace, no neat chimney sending smoke skyward. Instead, you get a hole or a pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke to make you wonder if you're slowly turning into an idiot. Yep, most houses didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just did its best, sneaking out through tiny holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or blowing straight into your lungs if you were feeling lazy that night. Not exactly ideal for breathing, ventilation, or, your overall lifespan. But hey, on the bright sides, it's great at keeping fleas and other unwanted guests away. Need pest control while marinating in smoke 24/7. The hearth's got you covered. You want to talk about pest control? The hearth is your smoky knight in shining armor. Seriously, nothing says medieval winter comfort like a fire pit that doubles as an insect repellent, warming you up. It's your kitchen, your light source, and sometimes the medieval version of a TV. People would gather round the fire to tell stories, gossip, or just stare into the flames because, honestly, what else was there to do after sunset? Keeping that fire alive wasn't just a good idea, it was mandatory. Letting it die out overnight was basically sending a cold chill to murder you. Also, lighting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as flicking a match. You had to use flint, steel, wood, and way more prayers than you'd expect. Everyone in the family had a job: fan the flames, tend the embers, add more embers, toss on some sticks, or if lucky, a precious dry log. It was a constant battle between human stubbornness and the suffocating cold trying to kill you. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was impossible. A tiny, smoky, crackling fire that often frustrated more than it comforted. But in medieval winters, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of beer, it was letting the fire die overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would rush in faster than the tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, having to start a fire from scratch wasn't just annoying. It could be deadly. Matches Ha dream on. To restart a fire meant banging flint and steel together. praying for a precious spark, then cradling that spark with tender love and whatever dry wood you hadn't burned in days. Imagine doing all that in freezing darkness, half awake, with numb fingers. Now add the howl of a hungry wolf in the distance for some extra motivation. So the peasants got clever. They banked their fires. No, not with a cushy savings account. Fire banking meant carefully burying the embers under a pile of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive, even if just barely. Until morning, do it right, and you could wake up at sunrise, poke the fire gently, add fresh wood, and boom fire without frostbite. Screw it up, and let's just say your morning was way colder and way less fun. Fire banking was an art passed down like a family secret recipe. Everyone had their little secrets. Some swore by only using dry ash. Others claimed a little moisture was key. Some packed the embers tight. Others let them breathe. You could literally start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better, more controversial method. Think of it as the ancient version of grilling debates. Only the stakes were survival, not just dinner. Sometimes just banking the fire wasn't enough. A gust of wind could sneak through a crack and snuff it out, or a clumsy sheep could trip over the hearth. Yep, that happened, which is why some families took turns waking up at night to check the embers, basically medieval sleepwalking with a thermostat. In the end, keeping the fire alive wasn't about conquering nature, but buying a few precious warm hours. And if you woke up to just a handful of glowing coals, consider it a win, enough to face another day battling the cold. In medieval times, the more, the merrier wasn't just for parties. It was a winter survival tactic when the fire flickered and the bitter wind howled through the cracks. One warm source was certain each other, and if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with family, neighbors, farm animals, and maybe a confused goose, so be it. Forget personal space. Privacy wasn't even a thing. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. Don't wake up frozen stiff on the floor. The whole family squeezed into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps. They grabbed whatever scraps of cloth they could find and stitched together what can only be described as a desperate snorer's lasagna. The little kids squeezed between parents. The elders huddled under outer layers. And if Cousin Ethel suddenly showed up, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got the cozy middle spot, where warmth radiated from every direction. If not, you were stuck on the edge, basically sleeping, next to the medieval meat locker door, and woe to anyone who moved too much at night. Shift once to get comfy, and suddenly you've shoved Aunt Morid into a blast of icy wind by the wall. Congrats, you're now the family villain. Sometimes even blankets and bedding got shared. A communal straw mattress slowly got squashed under the weight of generations every night. And since hygiene wasn't winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the freshest sleep situation. But hey, when you're facing frostbite, you don't get picky. Body heat wasn't just good, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even suggested placing the healthiest, warmest people on the outside, like human shields against the cold. Babies and the elderly got tucked way inside, treated like precious little heat generators. But this wasn't just about survival. Over time, it became part of daily life, a family bonding ritual, long winter nights, spent huddled together, telling stories, singing, and definitely having some very interesting chats under the shared wool blanket. So next time your siblings steal your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, remember, at least you're not fighting for space between a snoring uncle and a goat, or worse, being judged. If you think modern roommates are tough, medieval farmers want to introduce you to their winter roommates: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a heartbeat and a bit of body heat. Bringing animals inside wasn't just weird village tradition, it was survival. Livestock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated place where the wind howled louder than your stomach. Every bit of heat counted. Plus, if your goat lived right next to you, it was less likely to get stolen by neighbors in the middle of the night. 2 birds, 1 rotten stone at night. The house turned into a chaotic living furnace. Chickens roosted in corners, pigs snuffled near the hearth, and cows lounged comfortably by the wall, chewing cud like they were paying rent. It was not glamorous, not even close. If you've ever been stuck in a car during summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, just imagine that. But it's a cow. Now it's winter, and there's really nowhere else to go. The legendary aroma. By spring, the scent of shared winter had definitely deepened. No need for candles. Your nostrils were on a wild ride, but medieval farmers developed sharp noses. They didn't complain much because they knew an unpleasant truth: more animals inside meant fewer frostbitten toes come morning. Some animals even got prime spots. Cows, big and warm, usually took the center near the family. Goats got to come closer for warmth. And since goats are goats, they found a way inside anyway. Chickens perched on beams or old baskets, and pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, sometimes right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing. Your bedroom with livestock wasn't without risks. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely woken by a chicken thinking your hair is the perfect roost, or stepping barefoot on something suspicious. First thing in the morning. Yep, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, smells, and occasional horse hoof taps on the wall, farmers understood this simple math. Cold kills, and cows cuddling whether they liked it or not. In the battle against winter's frosty fingers, suspicious first thing in the morning. Yep, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the stink, and the occasional horse hoof tapping nearby, peasants understood this simple math. Cold could kill you, and cows hugged each other whether they liked it or not. In the battle against winter's frozen fingers, the warm, slimy breath of cows was often the difference between life and death. In medieval winter, fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Peasants didn't follow the latest trends, they just piled on clothes like they were suiting up to battle the Grim Reaper. The rule was simple: if you owned it, you wore it, sometimes all at once. First, the basic long underwear. A rough linen shirt? Probably not. The freshest. Over that, a thicker wool sweater. Then, if you're lucky, throw on knee-length leggings, a coarse cloak draped over your shoulders, and if you're really living large, a patched-up sheepskin cape like a medieval trophy. Congrats! Now you're about 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots, luxury. Most peasants wrap their feet in layers of rags or old cloth scraps shoved into wooden clogs. Still cold? Just add another rag and hope you don't lose any toes. And forget about washing all these layers. Doing laundry in the middle of winter meant hauling your clothes to a frozen stream, breaking the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your one and only shirt to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a sad little shirt cycle, most peasants wisely decided that the mixed stench of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not turning into a popsicle. Interestingly, all that dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grime held in body heat like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and way less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were precious treasures. Even a simple wool cap could mean the difference between waking up in the night or waking up with your hair glued to the wall. Gloves were often handmade from scraps of leather or fabric, sometimes looking more like sad puppets than fashion statements. Kids were swaddled tight until they looked like waddling stuffed radishes, all in the name of trapping as much precious body heat as possible. Style and elegance never heard of them. Warmth was the real flex in medieval times. So next time you complain about wearing layers on a cold day, remember medieval peasants basically rocked half a wardrobe at once, looking like walking laundry bags, and still considered themselves lucky. According to the medieval peasant handbook, dirt wasn't just something to scrub off. It was survival gear. Getting filthy wasn't giving up on life. It was strategy, a genius survival tactic. See, winter brought a very specific problem: heat loss. Fresh clothes, especially just washed ones, didn't keep you warm. Sure, they breathed, but when the air temp swings between hypothermia and instant regret, breathability isn't a selling point. Enter dirt. When peasants dragged themselves through day after day without washing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and mud started clinging to their long underwear, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural shield filled in fabric gaps, helping their clothes block the wind better. It's medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat that lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed bathing too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that sacred protective layer intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, if you had it at all, was reserved for serious occasions like when a bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. On top of that, peasants layered new clothes over old ones without changing the base layers. You just kept piling on last month's grime. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain told a heroic tale of slipping in the mud but not dying. Outsiders might have thought medieval peasants looked and smelled like total hygiene dropouts. But peasants knew better. That crusty, stiff cloak was their heat shield against frostbite. A bishop showing up, or maybe right before you kick the bucket. Plus, peasants layered clothes without swapping out the inner layers. You just piled fresh layers on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain told a heroic tale of how you slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outsiders, medieval peasants might look and smell like they'd totally given up on hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That crusty, stiff cloak was a thermal shield against freezing to death. Not glamorous? Sure, but dying of frostbite because you wanted to smell like flowers? No thanks. Besides, in a world where everyone stank, you weren't really offending anyone. Being nose blind was just a way of life. Yep, In medieval winter, being dirty wasn't failure, it was fashion, it was function, and if you'd built up a thick, greasy outer layer by February, my friend, you'd officially won at life. If you think medieval peasants spent their winters in fancy feather beds with embroidered blankets, think again. Reality was a bit rougher, and by rough, I mean sleeping on a pile of dead branches and hoping for the best. Beds, medieval farmers' beds, were basically rough wooden frames. If you were lucky enough to afford it, you'd cover it with a big sack stuffed with straw, dry grass, or old reeds. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no five-star hotel vibes. Just a crunchy, lumpy mess, a bit soggy, smelling like a barn and faintly regretful. Every night's toss and turn was like a tiny concert of rustling straw and the occasional jab of a rogue stick. Some farmers even skipped the wooden frame and just threw straw straight on the dirt floor, creating a deluxe earth connection sleep experience that modern influencers would probably hype up as a wellness trend. Straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw got flat, moldy, attracted bugs, and basically turned into a biohazard zone. Changing out the straw was a big event, usually a few times a year if you were diligent, or whenever your bed started. Moving without your permission, reeds were a popular alternative. These long grasses would be layered thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overpowering smell of livestock living nearby. The fresh reed scent lasted about a day. Then they just became part of the muddy floor, trampled into the house's landscape, blending seamlessly with dirt, leftover food, and whatever else got tracked in. And don't forget your bed buddies. Fleas, lice, and other lovely critters loved that straw bedding as much as the farmers did. If you woke up scratching more than sleeping, congratulations, you're living the true medieval experience. Despite all this misery, these humble beds were lifesavers. Those piles of straw provided crucial insulation against the freezing ground, and when piled up on top, they created shared heat pockets, medieval central heating at its finest. So, next time you flop onto your soft, supportive mattress, remember that somewhere out there, a medieval farmer is looking down from history, grinning with a mouthful of missing teeth, thinking, must be nice when you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and sheer optimism. You quickly realize winter winds aren't just annoying, they're personal attacks. Medieval farmers weren't just battling the cold outside, they fought it inside their homes, armed with whatever they could stuff into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks, crooked walls, crumbling mud, sagging thatch roofs. The cold seemed to find new, sneaky entrances every night, like a mischievous goblin fueled by grudges. Sealing the house became an art form. Farmers stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scrap cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal fur, if it was soft, mushy, or a poor insulator. It was probably wedged into some hole. The especially determined even slathered extra layers of mud and manure on the outside walls as a yearly winter project. Imagine standing out there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure on your house while muttering, "This is fine, very luxurious," because, in a weird way, it kind of was. Leaky roofs were another headache. Thatch roofs were cheap and common, but not exactly waterproof, especially after a few rainy or snowy seasons. Farmers patched holes using leftover cloth, bundles of dry grass, or in desperate times, stolen reeds from nearby fields. Every house eventually looked like a sad patchwork quilt someone forgot to finish. Life in between doors and windows. If you had them, consider yourself lucky, but even then, they were just stubborn wooden planks nailed shut. Window holes were usually covered with animal hide or thick cloth, soaked in animal fat to block drafts and add a weird scent to the room. Poor insulation basically means there's a draft sneaking in somewhere. Some folks were especially determined and slapped on extra layers of mud and manure on their walls like it was their annual winter DIY project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold poop on your house, muttering, "It's fine," totally luxurious, because, weirdly, it kind of was. Leaky roofs were a whole other headache. Thatch roofs were cheap and common, but not exactly waterproof, especially after a few rounds of rain and snow. Farmers patched holes with scraps of fabric or bundles of dry grass, or in desperate times, they'd steal clumps of grass from the nearest field, so eventually, every house looked like a sad patchwork quilt someone just gave up on. Life in between doors, windows, if you had those, congrats. But even then, they were just stubborn wooden planks nailed together. Window holes were often covered with animal hide or thick cloth, soaked in animal fat to block the wind and add a weird, lingering smell to the room. Living space was a nightly battle between human cleverness and relentless cold. One minute you're warm, the next, a sudden gust, it sneaks in through a mist crack, smacking you awake like the icy hand of fate. But somehow, thanks to cleverness, stubbornness, and a sort of permanent grumpiness, medieval farmers patched, stuffed, and wrestled their way through the harshest winters nature could throw at them, bit by bit. When the cold got so bad it stole your sleep, those medieval farmers had their own survival tricks. When the cold hit so hard it stole your sleep, medieval peasants had a clever hack. Spoiler, it wasn't pretending everyone snoozed at the same time. Nope. They invented shift sleeping. Yeah, like a military operation any general would drool over. But no whistles or roll calls here. It was way simpler and way more desperate. Half the family stayed up all night, tending the fire and patching drafty holes, while the other half curled up under thin blankets and dry grass, trying to snag a few precious hours of half-conscious sleep. Fires need constant babysitting. Let it die. And good luck reigniting that stubborn beast. It's like making a mule dance. So someone had to patrol the flames. And since no one wanted to wake up in a warm room, families took turns. You'd crash for a few hours, get elbowed awake, then stumble over to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life, all while trying not to step on the goat. This shift rotation, not glamorous. No night vision goggles, no midnight snacks, and definitely no snooze button. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and growing resentment toward whoever's snoring the loudest on your watch. Kids old enough to hold a stick got drafted too, because in winter, everyone had to pull their weight or freeze. The elders sometimes stuck around the fire longer, partly for their wisdom, and partly because arthritis made getting up a major event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck ignoring footsteps, rustling animals, wind banging on walls, and the occasional accidental shove from your siblings. Catching real quality sleep. Pure magic. But despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Shift sleeping meant there was always a pair of cold, reluctant eyes and hands ready to keep the fire alive. The embers stayed alive, and so did the family. So next time you whine about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, think about a medieval peasant squinting at smoky flames at 3 a.m., wondering if toes really do matter, because you know how cold it is when you're literally thinking about how to breathe just to survive. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold with cloaks, fire, and clever sleeping spots. They even adjusted how they breathed to make it through the night. The problem was simple. Breathing deeply through an open mouth meant straight up cold air into the lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say amen, that was a no-go. So peasants mastered what we now call survival breathing techniques. Instead of gasping like they'd just run a marathon, they breathed shallow, slow, and most importantly, through their noses. The idea warmed the air a bit before it hit the lungs. Not perfect, but way better than digging your own grave in February. If you accidentally inhaled a gulp of cold air, congrats. You just bought yourself a week of feeling like your soul's been kicked out with no doctor nearby and grandma brewing hot onion tea while praying hard. Some even shoved parts of their cloak, scarves, or rags over their mouths while sleeping, creating a makeshift shield to warm their breath temporarily. Sure, that meant a damp, slightly gross piece of fabric stuck to your mouth. But hey, better that than freezing from the inside out. Kids learned these tricks early. Parents scolded them for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months. Honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, graves in February, if you accidentally inhaled a gulp of cold air, congrats. You just bought yourself a 1-week ticket to cough up what feels like your soul. With no doctors nearby and grandma serving you hot onion tea and prayers, some even stuffed a piece of cloak, scarf, or rag over their face while sleeping, making a makeshift barrier to keep their breath warm. Of course, that meant a damp, slightly soggy cloth stuck to their mouth, but hey, better than freezing from the inside out. Kids learned these tricks early. Parents scolded toddlers for panting like dogs in the cold months. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to a gassy goat, medieval winters built character on a whole other level. At night, lying on straw beneath piles of cloaks and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form, slow, steady, only through the nose, as minimal as possible, like a gloomy medieval yoga retreat, but with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. In the Great Survival Handbook, it wasn't the flashiest move, but it worked. Every gasping breath was a small victory. Think of it as a gloomy medieval version of a yoga retreat, just way frostbitten and with zero inspirational quotes. In the Grand Survival Handbook, it's not exactly the flashiest move, but hey, it works. Every ragged breath. Those peasants tough it out for another night in the endless, brutal war against winter. In this never-ending medieval winter battle, peasants stumbled on a secret weapon nobody saw coming a full belly. Turns out, the best defense against the cold isn't a scratchy wool cloak. It's stuffing your body with something heavy and filling right before hitting the sack. Calories just as warmth. The more digestion your body has to do, the hotter it gets. That's medieval thermodynamics for you. Eat big, generate heat inside, and maybe make it to dawn without turning into a farmer-flavored popsicle. So, What did medieval peasants pile on their plates before a long, freezing night? Think thick stew, loaded with root veggies like turnips, onions, and rutabagas. Grains were the unsung heroes too: oatmeal, barley porridge, or dense rye bread. And if you hit the jackpot, say after a festival or a big slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage tossed into the pot. Not exactly Instagram food porn. No fancy plating, no artisanal garnish, just a giant, bland brown meal designed to settle in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly smoldering all night and keeping you a tad toastier. It's not just about eating a lot, it's about eating smart. Foods that take forever to digest give you a slow, steady heat supply. Fatty foods got extra props, not just for energy, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread, and a suspicious amount of fat, the height of medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest kids ate their fill. Didn't matter if little Thomas hated turnips. You ate turnips, or you'd shiver all night thinking about how much you missed them. Harsh but effective medieval parenting. Of course, overeating at night had its own risks. You might get warmer, sure, but also risk a night full of weird, vivid dreams thanks to your stomach trying to process a whole cabbage field. Worth it? Absolutely, because for peasants, the goal wasn't a Michelin star meal, it was survival. And if that meant going to bed stuffed, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, so be it. Just another night in the ongoing saga of watching frosty sunrises, long before electric blankets and heating pads. Medieval peasants had to get creative to snag a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how humble hay boxes and hot stones became the unsung heroes of winter. Let's start with the hay box. Sounds rustic, and yeah, it is, but this idea was pure genius. Peasants took a sturdy wooden box, lined it thick with hay, and used it to keep pre-cooked food warm for hours. Leftover stew, a hot porridge, tossed into the hay box, lid on tight, and voila, still warm for a midnight snack without firing up the stove again. Basically, the medieval slow cooker. But peasants didn't stop at food. They realized if hay could hold heat from a stew pot, it could hold heat from something even better: stones. Enter the hot stone era. Before bed, maybe, the unlucky kid who lost the family argument grabbed a flat rock and tossed it into the hearth. Once it was baked, almost too hot to touch, walking that fine line between warm and ouch. They fished it out with a stick or tongs. The stone still radiated a cozy heat, carefully wrapped in rags, stuffed into an old cloth, or slid into a clay pot, then tucked under the hay in the mattress or at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad ready to battle the frozen ground. All in the mattress or at the foot of the bed, a medieval hot rock ready to battle frozen ground. Of course, there's risk involved. If you don't wrap that rock right, congrats. You just got yourself a little indoor bonfire. And if you drop it on your foot, well, winter injuries aren't always from slipping on ice, but when things go well, that rock gives off precious, cozy heat that can last for hours. Not exactly luxury, but when you live in a half-frozen hut, luxury means not waking up with icicles dangling off your nose. In the great medieval survival toolkit, a hot rock stuffed in dry grass looks pretty bleak, but to peasants clutching at any warmth they can find, it's a tiny miracle in a medieval peasant's home. The hearth wasn't just where dinner happened, it was basically a family member, a hot-tempered, cranky, sometimes uncooperative family member. Sure, but still absolutely essential for survival, especially when bedtime rolls around. The closer you were to the fire, the better chance you had of waking up, unfrozen. That meant arranging your sleeping spot wasn't about personal comfort so much as strategic positioning. Babies, the elderly, and anyone sick or weak got first dibs on prime real estate. Parents, older kids, and healthier adults radiated out from there like human insulation. Getting a spot near the fire wasn't just about kindness, it was basic survival math. Kids were fragile little heat sources, and elders were the family's treasure trove of knowledge, and honestly, the biggest gossips. Keeping them warm was non negotiable, but sitting by the fire wasn't always comfy. Too close, and you risk waking up with your hair singed or your cloak suspiciously smoldering. Too far, and you might as well be camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. Stand close enough to enjoy the flames, but not so close that you have to explain to the neighbors why you look like a half-cooked roast. The fire's heat wasn't even either. It mostly torched whoever was right in front of it, while everyone else scrambled for the narrow heat like cold-blooded lizards fighting for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to sleep facing the fire, you got one warm side and one frozen solid enough to tap like a block of ice. Of course, pets and livestock got involved too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, wagging its tail dangerously close to the flames. Sometimes chickens perched dangerously on the hot rocks, clucking softly through the night like tiny feathered heat guardians. Every crackle of burning wood, every glowing ember shift was a tiny promise. You're still alive, still warm, and so the peasants drifted off to fitful sleep, lulled by the crackling and hissing of the fire, each breath forming little clouds in the bitter cold air outside the fragile fire circle. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfy, but it was life clinging to warmth by a single glowing ember in the medieval world. No one survived winter alone unless they wanted to become a super stylish frozen statue come January. Survival wasn't just a family matter, it was a village project, a messy, muddy, noisy collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on each other. Peasants knew that by midwinter, a big fire and a pile of dry grass were only going to get you so far. If your neighbor's house went dark, you'd notice. If Tom's chimney smoke suddenly stopped rising, someone would come check, and not just because Tom owes you a chicken, although that might help, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchmen, usually young or old folks who couldn't work the fields. Winter long, a big fire and a pile of hay was all you could really count on. If your neighbor's house went dark, here's the deal: if the smoke stops rising from Tom's chimney all of a sudden, someone's coming to check it out. Not just because Tom owes you a chicken, though. Sure, that's part of it, but because the community's survival depends on it. Every village had unofficial winter watchmen, usually young folks or the elderly. Since they couldn't work the fields, their job, keep an eye on anyone coughing up a storm, folks who hadn't hit the market in days, or houses that looked way too quiet on a frosty morning. These guys were basically medieval neighborhood patrols, minus the reflective vests, and plus a whole lot of sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was basically an emergency. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing ember wrapped in an old rag, or better yet, invite them into their smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yeah, that meant cramming 4 extra people into an already tight space. But hey, better than freezing outside. Way better than turning into popsicles come springtime. Community food stores played a role too during brutal winters. Sometimes villages had to dip into their last salted meat, grains, and dried veggies. That's charity with a punch. Nobody had much. But sharing a few meals could be the difference between making it to spring or not. Even the kids got it. They helped hand out firewood, share embers, and deliver urgent messages when someone needed help. Nobody was too small or too tired when winter hit. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Conflicts happened, land disputes, goat drama, or who borrowed whose fancy cooking pot. Those never really went away, but when the cold night fell, old grudges usually got quietly shelved. After all, showing up mattered because tomorrow you might be the one needing a rescue in winter's chill. The village turned into one big stubborn family, sometimes tense, sometimes downright funny, but always fiercely determined to survive together. A muddy boot, a crackling ember, a frozen smile all at once. When medieval farmers faced brutal winter cold, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke fires. They prayed. A lot. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside your thin paper walls, and the fire died down to smoldering ashes, you wanted every advantage you could get, including a little divine intervention. These days, faith isn't just a Sunday thing, it's woven into every frozen breath. Before burrowing under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families knelt together, hurried prayers hoping the fire would keep burning, the roof stay intact, and their toes still attached by mourning. Saints weren't just distant holy figures, they were the first line of winter defense. Take Samay, called on to protect against throat diseases. Not a tiny worry, when a single breath of cold air could make you cough your soul out. St. Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift giver later on. He was also begged to shield households from sudden ruin during deadly, failed harvest months. Superstitions tightly wrapped around daily life. Some families sprinkled holy water near the hearth before bed, hoping it'd fend off evil spirits or at least nasty drafts. Others marked their doorways with sacred chalk after certain holidays, begging for warmth and luck to find their way. Inside, candles played a part too, special prayer candles, often blessed by the local priest or the village's most devout old lady, sometimes burned all night a flickering prayer against the cold. Dark shadows clinging to the walls, and of course, no serious winter prayer was complete without a few promises. Lord, if you help us make it through tonight, I swear I'll be nicer to my neighbors, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some vague comfort. It was a daily emergency chat. Farmers didn't pray for luxury, just survival, a little warmth, some food, and one more day to hold on until spring broke the village's cold grip. That simple, raw hope whispered into smoky beams, woven into choked prayers, tucked beneath itchy blankets, somehow getting them through endless, ruthless winter nights. No matter the skill, prayers, or stubbornness medieval farmers brought, winter was still terrifying. Sometimes it just wasn't enough, and when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It wiped out entire families, whole villages, silencing them under thick snow and ice. Some winters were especially brutal, like the infamous Great Famine of 1315 when rain ruined The crops. Crops failed, livestock starved, and freezing cold turned already harsh lives into a slow, brutal disaster. People got so desperate, there were rumors of them munching on shoe leather and tree bark, and in the absolute worst cases, even eating each other. Losing the fire wasn't just inconvenient. Usually, it was a death sentence. No more warmth from the hearth. Families huddled together one last time. Neighbors sometimes stumbled upon entire households come spring, bodies still locked in each other's freezing grip, like they were trying to share a last bit of heat till the bitter end. Houses themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or savage ice storms. A roof falling in on a frozen night wasn't just bad luck, it was often deadly. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg for shelter from neighbors wasn't a sure bet, especially if those neighbors were already too stressed to care. Sickness loved the cold too. Starvation weakened bodies and cramped. Smoky homes turned into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other nasty infections. A simple December cough could easily turn into a January funeral. Then came the silent horror. Frostbite, fingers, toes, even ears turning black and dying while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived the winter, but at a steep cost, losing limbs. A grim badge of honor, reading I survived. But winter stole part of me. But the creepiest thing wasn't just death, it was how normal it all felt. People accepted that every winter. Some of them wouldn't see spring. Death wasn't a surprise, just another frostbitten neighbor at the door, waiting their turn, even in the freezing cold and constant threat. Medieval peasants kept going, stubborn and sorrowful, clinging to life, because as long as there was a flicker in the hearth, a breath left in the icy air, there was still a fight worth fighting. Looking back at those muddy, frozen survivors of endless winters, we usually just see hardship, cracked hands, frostbitten toes, smoky, cramped huts. But buried beneath all that struggle was something way tougher, the legacy of raw grit, stubbornness, and unbreakable endurance. They had no central heating, no cozy down jackets, no memory foam mattresses. They didn't even really believe they'd make it to spring. But what they had and left behind was the blueprint for resilience. Every straw mattress, every fire painstakingly kindled, every moss-covered crack in a wall was proof of human creativity under pressure. Facing impossible odds, they didn't despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the bitter lessons every harsh winter handed down. Their communities weren't just built on shared land. They were built on coexistence. They taught each other how to care for the sick, how to scavenge when food ran out, how to believe that helping a frozen neighbor today meant someone would help you tomorrow. They lived by the belief that no one beats winter alone. Their faith was a kind of stubborn endurance, too. They prayed every day, not just out of fear, but out of hope. A fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a bit warmer, a bit brighter. Hope that after hundreds of dark nights, spring would return, and life would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow, it did, thanks to their sacrifices, to their unglamorous victories. Surviving just one more night, one more storm, future generations finally thrived. Bit by bit, they dragged humanity forward, enduring winters their ancestors barely survived, until warmth and comfort became the norm instead of distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and raw skill are woven deep into our lives today. Another night, another storm, paving the way for future generations to thrive. Bit by bit, they pushed humanity forward just by enduring. Winters that their ancestors barely survived slowly turned into expected warmth and comfort, not some far-off dream. Their blood, sweat, and cunning are stitched into our lives today. Every cozy blanket, every snug house, every lazy winter evening sipping tea by a soft light, all thanks to countless medieval farmers who just wouldn't freeze to death. So next time the wind howls outside your double-glazed window, spare a thought for them. Those nameless, fearless folks who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn didn't just pop into the world with a crown on her head or an army at her feet. Born around 1501, maybe at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with some seriously powerful family ties. In Tudor society's grand scheme, Anne's birth barely caused a ripple, but from this humble start, something extraordinary began to take shape, a life that could change the course of English history. Even as a kid, Anne stood out not for money, but brains. She was sharp, lively, and downright magnetic. According to everyone, seeing her potential, her family sent her abroad where her real education kicked off. First, she served Margaret of Austria at the lavish Dutch court, an experience few English girls could dream of. There, Anne soaked up diplomacy, polished manners, and the subtle dance of European politics. But it was in France where Anne's talents truly sparkled. She spent years in the grand palaces of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirting, and wit. While other girls honed embroidery, Anne mastered conversation, catching attention, and the art of being noticed without seeming desperate. When she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was one of a kind, a woman who could match the sophistication of continental courtiers while carrying the ambition of a rising English family. She wasn't your classic beauty, even her fans admit it, but she was seriously captivating. Her dark eyes sparkled with intelligence. Her voice was quick and melodic, and her every move hinted at hidden purpose beneath elegant charm. Anne didn't just walk into a room, she changed its gravity at a time when a woman's fate was usually set by birth and marriage. Anne refused to fade quietly into oblivion. She'd seen the power charm and brains could wield at foreign courts, and she planned to use that knowledge back home. At this point, Anne Boleyn was still a young, smart, ambitious girl, untested, but history was already shifting around her. The girl returning to England was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was part of a bigger game, a game that would sooner or later swallow the crown whole. When Anne Boleyn came back to the English court, she was nothing like anyone the nobility had ever seen. In a world full of dull English roses, meek and mild, Anne was a storm strong, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Black hair, bold eyes, and a sharp, quick wit made her stand out from the gentle ladies, playing nice at King Henry VIII's court. At first, she took on the role everyone expected a bridesmaid to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle that just won't quit. She danced gracefully, spoke French like a native, and laughed with a confidence most women wouldn't dare flash. Men noticed, women gossiped, the whole court buzzed about the standout Boleyn girl. Soon enough, she caught the most dangerous attention of all the kings. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirting. His court was a playground for whispered promises and secret affairs. But Anne was different. She wasn't swooning over his compliments or leaping into his arms like the others. Nope. She teased. She challenged. She said no. Henry, used to admiration on a silver platter, was instantly hooked. The farther Anne kept him at arm's length, the deeper he fell. Their letters overflowed with love, frustration, and burning desire. Henry handed her the unofficial but most powerful role in court royal mistress. Anne shocked everyone by saying no. She wouldn't be just another conquest, a forgotten lover lost to time. If Henry wanted her, he'd have to make her his wife. Bold move, shocking the whole court. After all, the king was already married. Queen Catherine was beloved by the people and fiercely protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would have to be challenged before Henry could claim Anne. But Anne wasn't fazed. She'd lived in European palaces where queens wielded soft power behind lace fans and bright smiles. She knew ambition was a dangerous game, but she was dead set on winning. Standing in the candlelit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made a choice, not just to be admired, but to rewrite her fate and England's forever. What started as playful flirting between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn quickly spiraled into a national crisis. Henry wasn't just smitten, he was obsessed, and in that obsession, he was ready to tear down everything England had known for centuries. His desire to marry Anne hit one tiny snag. He was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, stern and steadfast, refused to quietly step aside. She'd been Henry's loyal wife for 2 decades and was the rightful queen in the eyes of God and England. Divorce wasn't just shameful, it was almost unthinkable. But Henry was determined. He convinced himself and tried to convince everyone else that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she'd been married to his brother Arthur. Never mind the special papal dispensation that had blessed their union years ago. Henry was insisting his soul would be damned unless he annulled the marriage. Anne, for her part, knew better than to seem too eager. She kept Henry at arm's length, feeding his hope but holding firm. Every glance, every word carefully measured. She wasn't just angling for marriage. She was positioning herself to be Queen of England. The court erupted with whispers and divisions. Some noble families eagerly courted Anne, sensing the winds of change. Others clung to Queen Catherine, horrified at the thought of Anne replacing her. Diplomats sent desperate letters back to Rome. Foreign kings threatened retaliation. Henry's advisors grew uneasy, feeling the ground shift beneath their feet. As time ticked, Henry's frustration only grew. He bombarded the Pope with petitions, hired lawyers to hunt for loopholes, and slowly realized the church wasn't about to cave. Catherine had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. His soul would be cursed unless he called off the marriage. Anne, for her part, knew better than to seem too eager. She kept herself just out of Henry's reach, encouraging his hopes while keeping her distance. Every word was carefully measured. She wasn't just aiming for marriage, she was positioning herself to be queen of England. The court buzzed with whispers and divisions. Some noble families eagerly courted Anne, sensing the power shift. Others clung tightly to Queen Catherine. Horrified at the idea of Anne replacing her, diplomats sent desperate letters back to Rome. Foreign kings threatened retaliation. Henry's advisors grew uneasy, feeling the ground shake beneath their feet. As time passed, Henry's frustration grew. He kept petitioning the Pope, pushing lawyers to find loopholes. Slowly realizing the church wasn't going to bend easily, Catherine had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Charles VI, the most powerful man in Europe. Still, Henry pushed on, ignoring advice, tradition, and even the law. His flirtation with Anne had become way bigger than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the very political and religious order of England. Anne wasn't just winning a king's heart, she was dragging an entire kingdom into uncharted waters. A dangerous game had begun, and there was no hitting rewind. After nearly 7 years of scheming, scandals, and diplomatic chaos, Anne Boleyn's gamble finally paid off. January 1533, she secretly married Henry VIII. Bold move, especially since technically, he was still married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and most of Europe. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey, supposed to be her greatest moment. But the vibe was anything but festive. Londoners watched with tired eyes. Some cheered, others muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many wondered if this flashy, bold new queen was a blessing or a disaster in the making. Anne didn't step onto the throne as a beloved figure, she was a storm. Unlike Catherine, who embodied traditional English values of humility and piety, Anne was charming, provocative, and politically savvy. She wore bright colors, ruled the court with sharp wit, and made powerful enemies faster than you can blink. Her position, though seemingly secure, was actually hanging by a thread. Everything hinged on one thing: giving Henry a male heir. Anne knew this better than anyone. She was no longer just Henry's lover. She was the hope of a dynasty. Early in the pregnancy, Anne and Henry were thrilled, convinced the baby would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth, to her credit. Anne masked her crushing disappointment by insisting the next child would definitely be a son. But Henry, not so chill. The admiration in his eyes turned to suspicion. Still, Anne's star shone bright for a while. She reshaped the English court in her image, elevated her family to heights never seen before, and became the first English queen crowned with holy oil, usually reserved for kings. Her influence was massive. Foreign ambassadors flocked to her, begging for favors. Courtiers scrambled to win her favor, shaking up alliances. Henry, once obedient, started officially breaking England away from Rome, founding the Church of England with himself at the helm, all to keep Anne's crown legit and unquestioned. But even in her victory, dark clouds gathered. Friends whispered behind backs, rivals circled, waiting, and Henry, restless and moody, began looking beyond the brilliant woman who'd rewritten his kingdom. Anne had won the throne, but holding on to it demanded more than charm, ambition, or even love. Anne Boleyn climbed higher than most women of her time. But the higher you go, the harder you fall from the moment she placed that crown on her head. Cracks started to show in her world. The core of Anne's struggle was the pressure to produce a male heir. Her firstborn, Elizabeth, smart and healthy as she was, wasn't the son Henry VIII needed to build a dynasty. And time was running out fast. Anne endured several pregnancies, each followed by heartbreak. Miscarriages left her physically weak and emotionally shattered. Every lost child chipped away at the foundation she'd built. Henry, once devoted, began to drift away. His disappointment cracked the bond between them. Anne, never one to suffer quietly, argued, demanded, and fought to keep her place. But Henry, a man who valued obedience over beauty, grew tired of her sharpness, her defiance, and the very fire that once drew him in. Outside the royal palace, enemies gathered like wolves. Many nobles who'd grudgingly tolerated Anne's rise now openly plotted her downfall. Supporters of Catherine of Aragon never forgave Anne for what they saw as theft and sacrilege. Even common folk whispered, "Forgive Anne for what they saw as theft and sacrilege." Even the common folk were whispering against her, calling her a big old slut, blaming her for the break with Rome and all the heavy-handed changes that followed. Then came Jane Seymour, quiet, low-key, nothing like Anne. Jane caught Henry's eye just as Anne's influence started to spread, while Anne dazzled him with her brains and sass. Jane played the obedient card. That's a dangerous change. And Anne, sharper than ever, totally saw it coming. She tried to claw back her spot, showering Henry with attention, promising more sons, begging for patience. But the king, fickle as ever, started daydreaming about life without the woman who once tore the kingdom apart for him. Anne's political enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, once her allies smelled the shift in the wind. They quietly laid the groundwork for a sabotage campaign, silently gathering accusations, rumors, and witnesses. The woman who played the dangerous game of ambition with such finesse was now losing her grip. Anne won her crown with cunning and courage, but in the brutal, ever-changing world of Henry's court, past victories meant squat. Only success mattered now, and Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives. The queen, who once shattered a kingdom, was about to find out just how fast a kingdom could shatter her. Anne Boleyn's enemies didn't attack with armies or swords. Nope. They came with whispers, secrets, and carefully crafted lies. Behind the court's curtains, betrayal simmered, quiet, patient, deadly. Thomas Cromwell, Anne's biggest ally in the English Reformation, had turned his back on her. Their alliance was built on shared ambition, but now their interests clashed. Anne wanted reform to help the poor and curb greedy nobles. Cromwell wanted stability, Henry's backing, and no interference. Anne's boldness made her dangerous, and in Henry's moody heart, love turned to frustration, suspicion, and chilly distance. Anne was left with very few real friends. Even her charm, once her deadliest weapon, now went against the court's desire for a softer, more pliable queen. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, waited just out of sight, the perfect contrast to Anne's fading fire. Cromwell made the first move, knowing Henry was restless, wanting out but lacking a convenient excuse. He offered a solution. What if Anne could be removed? Not by divorce that would embarrass Henry, but by disgrace. The accusations were absurd, bizarre, even adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. Anne, proud and clever queen, was painted as a traitor, a seductress, a threat to the very crown she once redefined. Cromwell carefully gathered evidence, coaxed confessions under torture, turned polite flirtations into damning testimonies. Several men, including Anne's brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges made no sense, full of contradictions and impossibilities. But in Henry's court, truth was whatever the king needed it to be. Feeling the noose tighten, Anne fought desperately. She tried to remind Henry of their love, but it was useless. The man who once tore England apart for her now couldn't bear to look her in the eye. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. When the heavy gates slammed shut behind her, she knew the truth. She was no longer queen. She was a prisoner, a scandal trapped in the brutal game she had once mastered. Betrayal had sealed her fate, and now, alone in the tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the final move. Anne Boleyn stood in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing the council of nobles, many of whom owed their titles and wealth to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and wary, ready to erase the woman who changed England's fate. The charges against her were staggering adultery with multiple men, including her brother, George Boleyn, treason, conspiracy against the king. In the Tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the final move. She stood in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing the noble council, many of whom owed their titles and fortunes to her rise. Now they sat judging her, cold and wary, ready to erase the woman who once changed England's fate. The charges against her were staggering: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, treason, plotting against the king. In any other world, such accusations against a queen would be unthinkable, but here and now, they were just a stage show, a dreary performance designed to give Henry VIII exactly what he wanted. Anne's downfall was cloaked in a flimsy veil of legality. She defended herself with the same fire that once won Henry's heart. She denied every charge with intelligence, precision, and an unshakable calm that made everyone listen. It even stunned her enemies. She reminded them she was crowned with holy oil, chosen by God, anointed Queen of England. She made them recall her loyalty, sacrifice, and love, but all of it was useless. The verdict was sealed long before Anne stepped into the courtroom. The trial was a public spectacle, a dramatic breakdown of a woman once thought unbreakable. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, spouted damning words. Dates and locations didn't even match. Evidence slim to none, but facts didn't matter anymore. Anne was guilty. Her brother George and a few other men charged alongside her were also sentenced to death. Anne's punishment, decapitation, a merciful upgrade from the usual traitor's death, hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the sentence was read and unchallenged, she stood tall, pale-faced but unbowed, in her last moments before being led back to her cell. She clearly stated she was ready to die and prayed for God's mercy on her soul as the heavy courtroom doors slammed shut behind her. The entire court breathed a sigh of relief. Anne's storm was fierce, dangerous, unforgettable, and nearly over. But even then, they didn't get it. They hadn't erased Anne Boleyn. They immortalized her in betrayal, tragedy, and legend. After the trial, Anne was taken back to the Tower of London not as a victorious queen ruling England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death. But even facing the end, Anne refused to crumble in the cold, echoing halls of the tower. She prepared herself. She spent hours praying, kneeling on the hard stone floor, hands clenched, voice steady. She confessed no crime because she believed she was innocent. She said she wasn't afraid to die, but prayed her death would bring peace to the kingdom and maybe mercy for her little daughter. Elizabeth? Her few loyal attendants wept silently, but Anne comforted them instead. Sometimes she bitterly joked she'd be remembered as the queen who lost her head. Her dark humor had a stubborn spark that made her unforgettable. Meanwhile, Henry VIII showed zero mercy. He shifted his attention to Jane Seymour, even before Anne's execution date was set. Henry was arranging his next marriage for Anne. This ultimate betrayal from the man who'd wrecked a kingdom for her had to be the deepest cut. On May 18th, 1536, Rheims was told she'd die the next morning. She barely slept that night. Instead, she spent her final hours praying, begging God to forgive everyone who wronged her, and maybe herself too, for the ambition and pride that led her here. Henry, in a royal act of kindness, arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution quicker, cleaner, less brutal than an axe. A small mercy probably bought more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort at dawn. Anne dressed carefully for her final moment, a dark gray damask cloak trimmed with fur, under which was a deep red gown, the color of solemnity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her black hair and hid it under a simple cap, ready to face the sword with grace. As the chilly morning mist curled around the stones in the courtyard, Anne Boleyn, Queen, Mother, Survivor, warrior stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, just one last brave act before history's judgment. Her death was near, but her story was just beginning. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn climbed the scaffold erected inside the Tower of London walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all silent, as if even the stone walls held their breath. Anne stood tall, her gray dress fluttering in the cold morning breeze. She looked thinner than at court, her face pale but calm, no freak out, no sobbing, if anything. She faced death with the same fierce dignity that once shook an entire kingdom. She spoke briefly, choosing her last words carefully. No blame, no self-pity. She prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very guy who had dumped her. In those final moments, Anne gave the world not just a confession, but forgiveness. Her courage shocked even the onlookers expecting a meltdown. The French executioner, brought in specifically for a quick death, stepped forward. Anne knelt straight up, hands clasped in prayer, eyes to the sky. A small white cloth was tied over her eyes. She stood still. The sword flashed once silent, swift, and Anne Boleyn, Queen, Mother, History Maker, was no more. She was buried quickly in a nameless grave within the tower grounds, laid in a wooden box because no proper coffin was ready. A queen who once wore a golden crown now vanished without ceremony. But Anne's story didn't end in that cold grave. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the kid who once disappointed a king at birth, became one of England's greatest monarchs. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign saw a dazzling golden age of English art, power, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp wit, and stubborn endurance. Anne Boleyn changed England forever. Her ambition helped spark the split with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her downfall showed the world even queens could be tossed aside, but through her bloodline, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy burned brighter than any crown she ever wore. In the end, Anne Boleyn achieved immortality, not by surviving, but by leaving a mark on history that refuses to fade. By the early 1770s, the American colonies were boiling over like a pot left too long on a flickering flame. Relations with England, once a proud motherland, had soured into growing anger, suspicion, and rage. It didn't start with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act pissed off colonists by taxing everything from newspapers to playing cards. Then came the Townshend Acts, taxing essentials like paper, glass, and paint. Each new law passed by a parliament thousands of miles away, without colonial representation, was like tossing a spark into dry brush. At first, protests were polite petitions and sharp pamphlets. Colonial councils drafted formal objections. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled newspapers with fiery arguments about freedom and rights. But over time, frustration only grew worse. A slow realization dawned that England wasn't listening. Worse, England didn't care. Many colonists clung to the hope that if they just made enough noise, argued hard enough, Parliament would scrap the taxes. And sometimes it actually worked. The Stamp Act got repealed after a massive colonial protest, but every small win was followed by new laws, new taxes, new humiliations. The issue wasn't money. It never was. The taxes themselves were modest by British standards. What ticked off colonists was the principle. They were taxed without consent, treated like subjects, not citizens, ruled like distant property, not partners. Boston, more than any city, became the heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive, passionate patriot group, grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions exploded into violence when British soldiers fired on unarmed civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blood stained the cobblestones. Trust became a thing of louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions exploded into violence when British soldiers opened fire on unarmed civilians during what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blood stained the cobblestones. Trust was a thing of the past. By 1773, the colonies teetered on the edge of disaster. One last humiliation would push them into open rebellion. And it didn't come in the form of soldiers, laws, or a new army, but through the quiet, almost harmless-looking barrels full of tea. The colonists had no idea that on the night those tea crates floated on the cold Boston harbor, the world would change forever. In 1773, Parliament made a huge mistake, believing that the struggling British East India Company and simultaneously remind the colonies whose boss with taxes. On paper, it looked like a sweet deal. The Tea Act let the company sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen, dropping prices, and offering luxury tea at bargain rates. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything, because the problem wasn't the price of tea, It was the principle behind it. The Tea Act still kept the hated tea tax in place. Accepting the tea, even at a discount, meant acknowledging Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent, and for many Americans, that was unthinkable. Surrendering freedom they'd fought for over a decade. No way. News of the Tea Act spread like wildfire across the colonies. Merchants were furious, their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that could crush local trade. Patriots were outraged too. The Crown still thought it could do whatever it wanted. In Boston, the backlash was especially fierce. A city haunted by the Boston Massacre and years of economic hardship. People saw the Tea Act for what it was, a trap disguised as a deal. Refusing the tea became a matter of honor, a loyalty test to freedom's cause. Public meetings swelled. Firebrand speeches lit up the town like wildfire. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and friends, organized boycotts, vowing not to unload, sell, or drink a single leaf of East India Company tea on American soil. Across the colonies, ships carrying the controversial tea were refused by locals, from New York to Charleston. The message was clear: we're not buying your bribe. But in Boston, things took a different turn. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, anchored stubbornly in the harbor and refused to leave. Royal officials demanded the tea be unloaded. The colonists said no. A stalemate stretched tight, like a drawn bow. The tension was unbearable. Just one action could snap it, and history would never be the same. When the British tea ships stubbornly moored in Boston Harbor, the city turned into a powder keg. Every day without resolution cranked up the pressure. Boston wasn't just protesting, it was gearing up for war. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists debated their next move. The Sons of Liberty, fired up by voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved fast to organize resistance. They publicly called for a boycott of British tea and held fiery meetings packed with farmers, artisans, and merchants. Each gathering poured gasoline on the fire. The Old South Meeting House became the rebel command center. Thousands packed the wooden hall, their breath fogging the air, voices booming with defiance. Resolutions were passed, speeches made, and spirits ignited. Every vote against unloading the tea was a slap in the face to British authority. But while Boston stood united, time was ticking. British law demanded imported goods, like tea, be unloaded and taxed within 20 days. If ships overstayed, customs officers could seize the cargo and collect the tax by force. The Sons of Liberty knew that once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle was lost. This was no longer just about tea. It was about whether the colonies would accept being treated like powerless subjects or stand up and fight for their future. Gunpowder barrels. Every day without a solution only ramped up the tension. Boston wasn't just resisting, it was gearing up for war. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved fast to organize resistance. They posted public notices calling for a boycott of British tea and held tense meetings packed with farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. Each gathering poured more fuel on the fire. The Old South Meeting House became the Resistance HQ. Thousands squeezed into the wooden hall, their breath fogging the air. Voices ringing out defiantly. Here resolutions were passed, speeches made, and everyone was fired up. Every vote against unloading the tea was a hard slap in the face to British rule. But while Boston united, time kept ticking. British law demanded imported goods, like tea, be unloaded and taxed within 20 days. If the ship stayed past the deadline, customs officers would seize the goods and enforce taxes by force. The Sons of Liberty knew once the tax was paid, even if protested, the principle was lost. This wasn't just about tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would accept being powerless subjects or stand up and fight for their future. Meanwhile, Massachusetts's royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, held firm. He refused to let the tea ships leave without unloading, demanding the law be obeyed. The colonists' outrage was totally justified. For him, backing down meant admitting the mob, not the monarch, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff became a dramatic spectacle. Every man, woman, and child knew something big was about to go down. You could feel it in the air, a cold, sharp tension right before the storm. When the whole world holds its breath, just one spark could set it off. And somewhere in the crowded streets and the beating heart of Boston, a silent decision was taking shape, a plan that would echo across oceans and empires. December 16th, 1773. Gray, cold skies hung over Boston, a city teetering on the edge of history for nearly 3 weeks. The tea ships had sat in the harbor like ticking time bombs. Now the deadline was here. British law said the tea had to be unloaded and taxed within 20 days of docking. Miss that, and customs officers could seize the goods, and the British Army could be called in. It was the law. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea made it ashore, the principle was dead. If the colonists let that happen, even for their own reasons, their claims to rights and freedom would shatter that morning. Thousands of Bostonians and nearby settlers packed into the Old South, Meeting House, the biggest building in town. Some had trekked miles through frozen countryside just to get there. The crowd spilled out into the streets, trying to catch the fiery speeches echoing down the hallways. Samuel Adams, the rebel movement's tough-talking voice, chaired the meeting. One speaker after another rose to condemn the Tea Act, denounce tyranny, and call for immediate action. But even amid all the bravado, uncertainty lingered. How do you act without triggering full-blown war? How do you stop tea shipments without flinging wide the gates to brutal retaliation? As the afternoon wore on, riders galloped in with grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson stood firm. The ships wouldn't leave until unloaded. Tea would be seized, taxes collected, the king's law enforced. The crowd buzzed with rage. The meeting house walls seemed to shake with the force of their fury. Not yet. Samuel Adams calmly stood and dropped words signaling the debate's end. This meeting could do no more to save the country. Simple, but everyone knew what that meant. No more petitions, no more compromises. Action was coming. Outside, battle cries shattered the gloomy atmosphere. The signal. Men quickly disguised themselves, smearing soot on their faces, wrapping themselves in rough blankets and feathers, like Mohawk warriors' primitive style. It wasn't about fooling anyone. The point was to create a symbol, a message no one could misread. The deadline had passed. Boston would answer not with words, but with defiance. As sunset fell over Boston On December 16th, 1773, quiet streets started to stir. Shadowy figures moved through the dark. Ordinary men cloaked in rough blankets, faces blackened with soot, some sporting feathers. They weren't trying to convince anyone they were real Mohawks. Their disguise was symbolic, a shedding of old identity, a rise into something new, something fierce. Dozens headed to Griffin's Wharf, where 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, were docked. The harbor water was cold and dark below them, thickened by winter's biting chill. No yelling, no drunken chaos. This wasn't a riot. It was a mission carried out with ruthless calm and precision, armed with axes and clubs. The disguised colonists stormed the ships, overwhelming the few sailors left aboard. No sailors were harmed, so they were shoved aside, silently watching the surgery begin. The men expertly smashed open wooden chests, the fresh scent of tea filling the cold night air. Others heaved barrels, the sailors. They were pushed aside, silently watching the operation begin. The men used practiced swings to smash open wooden chests, the fresh scent of tea flooding the cold night air. Others tossed the barrels into the water, splashing into the sea. Water sprayed wildly across the calm harbor surface. Barrels, 342 of them, to be exact, were smashed open and dumped until a swirling black wave of tea leaves churned the water. The crowd watched silently from the shore. Not a single British sentry nearby made a move to stop it. Still, it's unclear if they were just confused, sympathetic, or too scared of things getting uglier. Some records suggest even loyalists kinda got it. Something had shifted. Something deeper bubbled up. An undeniable truth was shared. The era of peaceful protests was over. The showdown, and nothing was gonna stop what was about to go down tonight. The discipline off the charts. No loot was stolen. Nope. No one hijacked the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the hated symbol of British oppression, was in the crosshairs. In a town where hunger and hardship were daily struggles. These guys could have easily used the protest as an excuse to loot, but they didn't. When it was all over, the harbor looked like a giant swirling cauldron, filled with torn crates and tea leaves soaking everywhere. The salty air mixed with the bitter scent of crushed tea leaves, making the night smell weirdly sweet and bitter. The job was done. The men quietly melted back into the night, slipping into Boston's alleys and side streets. No names, no leaders, no glory, just the unmistakable mark of a revolution. As the last broken crates floated in the dark water, Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot, a brawl, or a drunken mess. It was something way rarer, a cold, deliberate middle finger thrown under the cover of darkness. The harbor had turned into a giant, swirling teapot. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea bobbed in big clumps, turning the water black. Some curious and rebellious colonists picked up handfuls of soggy leaves from the docks, only to be scolded by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the piers. Nothing could be saved anymore. Tonight's stunt wasn't about profit. It was pure principle, plain and simple. The next morning, the town woke up with the strong smell of tea hanging in the air. The news spread faster than wildfire. Word of mouth, letters, flyers. By noon, everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had happened. Opinions split fast. Patriots swelled with pride. a fierce pride that ordinary men had stood up against the world's mightiest empire and fought for freedom. Loyalists and moderates, they were horrified. To them, property destruction was reckless and dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line of no return, Governor Thomas Hutchinson threw a fit in his mansion, furious not just about the destruction, but the message it sent. If the king's power could be openly challenged like this in Boston, where else could rebellion break out? British officials were stunned. They expected protests, boycotts, maybe another Stamp Act riot. What they didn't expect was organized, disciplined revolutionaries calmly destroying tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without breaking a single window. The captains of the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver could only helplessly watch their cargo sink beneath the waves. Official records put the losses at over $10,000, a hefty sum, but the real loss wasn't measured in pounds or ruined tea. It was measured in trust, loyalty, and the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled its colonies by consent. The night the tea sank, something deeper surfaced. An undeniable truth was shared. The era of peaceful protest was over. The reckoning was coming, and Boston was ready. When news of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic to London, the reaction was swift and fierce. To British officials, this wasn't just a protest. It was rebellion, a blatant challenge mocking royal authority that couldn't be ignored. Legend has it, King George III was livid when he heard the news. Parliament, already frustrated by years of colonial defiance, exploded with outrage, was about to go down, and Boston was ready. When news of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic and hit London, the reaction was swift and fierce. To British officials, this wasn't just a protest. It was straight-up rebellion, a public middle finger to royal authority that couldn't be ignored. Legend has it, King George III was so mad he practically exploded. Parliament, already fed up with years of colonial disobedience, now boiled over in rage. They demanded punishment not just for Boston, but as a warning to all American colonies. And thus, a series of harsh laws were slapped down and quickly dubbed unacceptable acts. In America, the first blow came fast, the Boston Port Act. With brutal efficiency, Parliament ordered the bustling Boston Harbor shut-tight economic lifeblood cut off until the destroyed tea was paid for and order restored. No ships in or out. Trade vanished overnight. Supplies ran dry. Boston, once lively and vibrant, was left gasping. But the punishment didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of self-rule, putting it under tight royal control. Officials appointed by the king took over, telling the locals who's boss. The Administration of Justice Act let royal officials accused of crimes get retried back in England. Basically, a big hands-off from the British government. To make sure the colonies got the message force was on the table, the British Army camped all over Boston, living right among the people they were supposed to control. The message was crystal clear: rebellion would be crushed. Freedom, a luxury the crown was done with. But Congress's heavy-handed crackdown backfired spectacularly. Instead of scaring the other colonies into submission, it made them mad as hell. News of Boston's suffering closed ports, starving people under martial law, sparked deep sympathy and righteous anger across America. Wagons loaded with food and supplies rolled in from neighboring colonies. Letters of support, promises of unity, and secret meetings started knitting the colonies together. What was once Massachusetts's problem suddenly became everyone's problem. When Britain punished Boston, they hoped to make an example out of it. Instead, Boston became a symbol, a rallying cry for resistance. The revolutionary spark, once flickering in remote places, now blazed from colony to colony, and it wasn't going out anytime soon. Boston's punishment sent shockwaves all the way to Massachusetts's rocky shores. Across the 13 colonies, anger turned into something way more dangerous for Britain unity. For years, the colonies acted like distant cousins bickering, competing, divided by geography, religion, and trade rivalries. But when Parliament shut down Boston's port and stripped Massachusetts of self-rule, Americans coast to coast realized if Boston could get this treatment, so could anyone, from Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire. The reaction was swift. Colonists sent wagons full of food, supplies, and sympathy letters to suffering Bostonians. Town meetings bubbled with fury. Printers worked overtime spreading the news. This fight wasn't just Boston's anymore. It was everyone's. And so, in September 1774, something totally new happened. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. For the first time, reps from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered under one roof to figure out a united response. Guys like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, once just local big shots, now stood together as the architects of a growing movement. Officially, their goal wasn't full independence yet. Most still hoped for reconciliation, a return to mutual respect under the British Crown. But beneath polite debates and carefully crafted petitions, a deeper understanding was taking hold. The colonies couldn't go it alone anymore. At the Congress, they agreed on a total boycott of British goods. They promised to back each other up against any future British attacks, and they made clear any attack on one colony would be an attack on all. In taverns and meeting halls across the continent, regular folks started using words once whispered in private unity: resistance, freedom. When Britain struck at Boston, they thought they'd squelch the rebellion. Instead, they welded the colonies into something way more dangerous. A people, despite their differences, began thinking of themselves not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The revolutionary winds weren't just stirring anymore. They were gathering into a storm, and it was too late for Britain to stop it. The night the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't just the tea crates getting trashed. It was the fantasy that America's colonies would forever be loyal subjects. The Boston Tea Party sparked a fire no distant king, army, or parliament could ever snuff out. In the months that followed, that fire spread like gossip at a family reunion. What started as protests, boycotts, and polite petitions turned into full-on rebellion. Town militias began drilling in broad daylight, stockpiling gunpowder and bullets. Those who once toasted King George III in taverns now whispered revolution under one roof. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice, ravaged but unbowed, the tighter England squeezed. The more the colonies slipped through their fingers, every silent, shuttered ship in Boston Harbor was a quiet reminder that tyranny had met its match, America, when Parliament passed the intolerable acts. They meant to make an example of Boston to scare the other colonies into line. Instead, they created a martyr city, a rallying cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists realized their fates were tied together. Resistance was no longer about tea. It was about survival, identity, and freedom. By spring 1775, tensions peaked outside Boston. In the villages of Lexington and Concord, British troops were sent to seize colonial weapons, but met armed farmers, regular guys ready to defend their rights with muskets. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out, a direct line back to that moment when people chose principle over profit and dumped a fortune's worth of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party showed the world revolutions don't always start with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it's just a quiet bunch of stubborn folks standing in the cold, choosing defiance over fear. When they dumped the tea, the colonists weren't just protesting taxes, they were rejecting an empire. And although the road ahead was bloody, bitter, and uncertain, one thing became clear: that night at Boston Harbor, the American colonies were no longer loyal subjects. They were something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they were just getting started. Before the towering pyramids of Giza, before the bustling cities of Mesopotamia, before Stonehenge stood tall against the sky, there was Corral, nestled in the dry valleys along Peru's coast. Corral rose quietly nearly 5,000 years ago, then faded into oblivion, swallowed by sand and forgotten by history. For centuries, the world didn't even know it existed. The massive valley where Corral once thrived looked, at first glance, like a place no civilization could survive. Dry, barren landscapes, with a river that was little more than a fragile silver thread weaving through rocks and dust. To most, it looked lifeless, a ghost town before ghost towns were cool. Yet right here, amid the desolation, one of humanity's earliest cities took shape. Corral wasn't just a scatter of huts or a temporary trading post. It was a sprawling city, covering over 150 acres, with the pyramids, plazas, residential areas, and ceremonial spaces. It had scale, purpose, and vision, a complex society that blossomed centuries before the Egyptians started stacking stones for their pyramids. The people of Corral did this without wheels, without written language, without metal tools. They built massive stone and earth structures purely through skill, teamwork, and sheer human willpower. But for thousands of years, Corral's existence was a secret. Even when visitors stumbled across strange weathered mounds scattered across the valley, they mistook them for natural rock formations, just hills shaped by desert winds. No one could imagine that beneath the sand lay one of the oldest cities. When explorers stumbled upon strange weathered mounds scattered across the valley, they just assumed they were natural rock formations, ordinary desert hills sculpted by the wind. Nobody could imagine that beneath that sand lay one of the oldest cities on Earth, predating even the civilizations history books call the first. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists, led by Ruth Shady, uncovered the truth. What they found buried in the dust of time would rewrite the story of the Americas and force the world to rethink everything it thought it knew about the birth of civilization. Carol rose, thrived, and fell all in total anonymity. After thousands of years of silence, the stones finally speak, whispering about a smart, peaceful people who built a complex, amazing world on land where life seemed impossible. And that's just the beginning of their story. At first glance, the Supa Valley looks like a place where life has to fight tooth and nail just to survive. Fierce winds whip across endless sand and rock. The sun beats down mercilessly, baking this earth into cracked, brittle layers. Water's scarce, and the twisting river means people are always struggling to stay alive. To the untrained eye, it's a barren wasteland, empty and forgotten by the gods. But the people of Carol saw something else. They didn't see a scary desert. They saw a blank canvas waiting to be shaped. They realized the river, though modest, was the lifeblood of possibility. And so, with patience, skill, and absolute determination, they turned this harsh place into a thriving oasis of life and culture. Their first win was farming. They learned to tame the seasonal floods of the river, building simple but effective irrigation systems to channel water through the valley. Where others saw only dust and sand, they planted seeds of green hope. Cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes, cotton in particular, became their treasure. It was spun into fishing nets and textiles, sparking trade with coastal villages and creating connections far beyond their desert home. But farming was just part of their mastery. The people of Corral understood that desert survival demanded balance. They worked with nature, not against it. They built houses and plazas from stone and earth, designed to withstand both the scorching heat and the rare, fierce rains that sometimes pounded the valley. They studied the stars and the seasons, planning harvests with the precision of master astronomers. Trade became the lifeblood and arteries of Corral's economy. Dried fish, cotton, fruit, and crafts were sold along the coast. In return, Corral scored exotic goods, colorful shells from the Pacific, rare gems from the Andes, ideas from distant peoples. They weren't isolated, they were connected. In a land where survival seemed impossible, Corral thrived thanks to intelligence, innovation, and community spirit. They didn't conquer the desert with brute force. They cooperated with it, learning its rhythms, respecting its power, building a society that wasn't just functional, pretty extraordinary, against all odds. Corral rose as a beacon of civilization, and this was just the beginning of its rise, growing from the desert like ancient guardians. Carol's pyramids challenge everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. These aren't tiny, rough structures made by clumsy hands. They are massive architectural feats, deliberately built by visionary, organized, and ambitious people. The city's highlight is the largest pyramid, Corral's most colossal architectural work. It stretches over 450 feet long and nearly 60 feet tall above the desert floor, an engineering marvel on par with the original wonders of the ancient world, built from stone, mud, and reed-woven bags stuffed with rocks. This pyramid was designed not just to survive the harsh climate, but to withstand the fierce earthquakes that occasionally shake the area, and it has held firm, standing silently against wind and time for nearly 5 millennia. But the Corral pyramids aren't tombs. Unlike the massive burial complexes in Egypt, Corral's pyramids serve a different purpose. They're centers of ritual, power, and public life. Temples and gathering spaces sit atop hills, reachable by wide, elegant staircases. Fires once burned on these stone altars' summits, and ceremonies were held under Peru's endless sky. At the pyramid's base, large plazas open up, sunken and circular, inviting thousands to gather for religious rites, political meetings, and community celebrations. Carroll's cityscape design suggests a society that valued community and order, a people deeply connected with each other and the universe, Around the pyramids, smaller settlements spread out, probably homes for priests, managers, artisans, and farmers. The pyramids themselves seems to be strategically placed, aligned with celestial events, sunrises, solstices, and star cycles. For the Carol people, architecture was more than just practical. It was spiritual, mathematical, and cosmic. Walking among these weathered stones today, you can't help but feel this strange awe. These structures were built without metal tools, wheels, or beasts of burden, yet somehow they still rise with stunning symmetry, scale, and precision. The Great Pyramids of Corral weren't built for vanity or war. They were made to connect earth and sky, community and cosmos, humanity and eternity, and they still whisper on the sands, telling a story you won't forget. Among the ruins of Corral, there's something completely different, something that sets this place apart from so many other ancient civilizations. No weapons were found buried in the sand. No defensive walls surrounded the plaza. No mass graves hinting at bloody conquests or internal conflict, unlike kingdoms that rise and fall through war. Corral was a society built on peace. It's a revelation beyond. This was a civilization that grew not by violence, but through teamwork, trade, and shared trust. The folks at Corral seemed to pour their energy not into armies or fortresses, but into architecture, astronomy, music, and community life. Their plazas and pyramids weren't trophies of war, but centers for festivals, worship, and governance. This was a civilization that chose gathering over conquering, negotiation over destruction. Trade was the engine. Behind Corral's success, cotton grew along the fertile rivers, woven into fishing nets to trade with coastal communities. In return, Corral got dried fish for protein and exotic goods from far-off places, colorful shells from the Pacific, gemstones from the highlands, and even rare tropical fruits from distant valleys. This vast trade network tied the whole region together, linking remote communities into a peaceful, mutually beneficial web. At the heart of it all, Corral thrived as a cultural and economic hub. Religion and ritual played a big role in keeping social harmony. The city's large public spaces and sunken plazas were probably where rituals brought everyone under the same spiritual vibe. Music filled these gatherings. Flutes carved from vulture bones, drums made from deer hide, creating sounds echoing across the desert, tying each person's life to something way bigger. Leadership seemed less about military muscle and more about spiritual power and citizen organization. City leaders must have juggled big building projects, seasonal farming cycles, and complex trade deals, all without leaving the brutal scars of war behind. In an ancient world full of conflict, Corral stands out as a shining exception, a reminder that civilizations don't have to rise on the broken ribs of this conquered. They can be built on the quiet strength of cooperation, creativity, and trust. At Corral, the stones still seem to hum with echoes from a long-gone world. This wasn't just a city of buildings and trade. It was a living city filled with sound, ritual, and spiritual rhythm. Music and ceremony wove into the heartbeat of Corral's civilization. Archaeologists carefully dug through dry sand and uncovered a treasure trove of ancient instruments, flutes made from vulture and pelican bones, horns from deer antlers, small drums stretched with animal hide, These weren't simple toys. They were meticulously crafted to play specific notes, designed to carry sound across the city's vast plazas. In a world without written language, music spoke the language of the soul. Imagine this: deep drum beats rising at dusk, flutes wailing like desert winds, footsteps pounding the sunken plaza as hundreds gathered under, fading light, fires crackling atop pyramid platforms, priests in elaborate woven robes chanting prayers to river gods, earth spirits, and stars. At that moment, Corral wasn't just a city, it was a symphony. Even the city's layout shows ritual life was its core. The big plazas weren't just open spaces, they were stages for community ceremonies, carefully designed to pull people closer together. The sunken circular arenas were like ancient amphitheaters, focusing sound and sight on rituals performed center stage. And towering above all, the pyramids, not tombs, but sacred mountains crafted by human hands. Bridging earth and heaven, rituals probably marked seasonal changes, planting and harvest cycles, the movement of the stars. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a bridge between people, nature, and the divine, between the known and the mysterious ahead. No violent murals, no scary war gods, no, the bloodthirsty sacrifice ceremony. In Corral, the spiritual world seemed more like a world of harmony, celebration, and respect. Even today, when the desert wind whistles through the ruins, you can almost hear it, the soft tunes of ancient music, forgotten songs of a people who found beauty, meaning, and connection amidst the harsh, endless sand. Carol wasn't just about music, trade, and rituals. It was a technical marvel, proving human skill in one of Earth's toughest neighborhoods. No metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals. The folks of Corral built a city from stone and earth that's been standing strong for nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements are downright jaw-dropping. Giant pyramids rose from the desert, built not from fragile little bricks, but massive stone blocks hauled across barren valleys. Workers carried stones in reed bags, sturdy baskets woven from plants growing along the riverside, tough enough to bear heavy loads. They built layer by layer, carefully stacking stones and filling the insides with rubble to create structures that could withstand not just time, but nature's fury. And they really knew nature. Carol sits in a major earthquake zone, yet their pyramids and plazas are still intact. How by mastering earthquake-resistant architecture, builders used flexible construction techniques, packed earth, wide foundations, and rounded corners to help their monuments absorb and disperse seismic energy. This wasn't textbook stuff. It came from a deep understanding of the earth itself. Water management was another quiet victory, despite living in a desert. The people of Corral developed advanced irrigation, carefully dug canals channeled river water to their fields, helping crops thrive even during dry seasons. Not a drop wasted. Every drop counted. The layout of Carol reflects brilliant urban planning, main structures aligned with astronomical points, showing a deep grasp of solar cycles. Sunken plazas with precise shapes weren't just gathering spots, they were tools for tracking the sky, letting priests and astronomers predict crucial seasons for survival. Even the city's organization tells of a complex society: residential zones, administrative areas, ceremonial centers, all arranged harmoniously, balancing community life with sacred space. They built not just for the present, but for generations to come. Today, modern engineers marvel at corral's resilience, realizing greatness isn't just about tech. Sometimes the sharpest wisdom lies in understanding nature's power, cooperating with the land instead of fighting it. Corral's stones have weathered storms, earthquakes, and the erosion of time. They stand as silent proof of a civilization that etched their dreams into desert sand for centuries. Corral thrived as a symbol of peace, music, trade, and masterful architecture amid the sandy wilderness. Then quietly, almost without a trace, it was abandoned. No fire marked its fall, no conquest scars on the walls, no mass graves or smashed monuments telling tales of sudden disaster. Instead, Corral just faded away, empty plazas, pyramids left to drift on the sands. The flutes and drums fell silent over time. Why did they leave? That question still haunts the valley like a ghost. Some scholars believe environmental change dealt the final blow. There's evidence a long drought might have crippled Corral's agriculture. Without the life-giving river water, fields would wither. The trade network, reliant on cotton and surplus food, would stall. The delicate balance Corral maintained in its harsh environment might have finally tipped beyond repair. Other theories point to shifting trade routes. As neighboring cultures grew and new power centers popped up along the coast and inland, Corral's influence may have faded. Maybe the goods they once supplied, cotton, fish, crops, just weren't enough anymore. Still enough to keep its role as a dominant city. The lifeblood of trade was drying up. Others whispered about internal decay. Without records, all we have are guesses, political struggles, religious upheavals, or simply exhaustion after centuries of growth. Even peaceful societies can crumble when survival feels shaky. Whatever the cause, the exit seemed slow, not a sudden drop-off. Maybe families packed up one by one, chasing greener valleys, stronger rivers, and fresh starts. Kids who once ran through Corral's plaza grew up telling stories about a lost city behind them. Those stories eventually turned into legend. The desert reclaimed what humans had built. The wind carried fine sand, sweeping across stone temples. Flutes lay buried beneath shifting dunes. What was once a bustling, lively civilization is now just a silent field of earth mounds, sleeping for nearly 4,000 years. Corral stayed, hidden, whispering beneath the sand, waiting. Today, as archaeologists carefully unearth stones, the question's still hot. How does a city this advanced and beautifully built just vanish? Maybe the truth is, even the greatest civilizations, no matter how wise or peaceful, are fragile, like threads woven into the tapestry of time, always vulnerable to invisible forces of change over millennia. Corral got forgotten, buried under the silent sands of a vast valley. Travelers crossing the weird round hills, scattered everywhere, never guessed that beneath their feet lay ruins older than the Egyptian pyramids. To them, these were just natural mounds, hills shaped by wind and time. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the world heard Corral's voice again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Supe Valley, driven by curiosity and a growing feeling that these hills might hide secrets no one had discovered yet. What they found rewrote the story of civilization in the Americas, layer by layer. Sand was carefully brushed away. Beneath it were carefully cut stone walls, grand staircases, sunken plazas, pyramids a city older than anyone imagined. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the unbelievable. Corral existed over 4,600 years ago, growing alongside the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. This discovery shook archaeology to its core. Before Corral, scholars believed civilization in the Americas came much later, overshadowed by the great empires of the Old World. Corral changed everything. It proved the Americas birthed huge architectural feats, complex urban life, and independent social organization long before the Incas or the Moche Rose. Ruth Shady and her team didn't just find stones and rubble, but remnants of life musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, knotted cords, and even ritual offerings to the gods. Each artifact tells a story of a people who built a society with vision, intellect, and deep creativity. Rediscovering Corral wasn't just an academic win, it was a resurrection, a civilization that slept under the desert for thousands of years, appeared once more beneath the vast sky. Plazas once surrounded by winds, carrying flutes and children's laughter. Today, Corral is UNESCO World Heritage, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's original dreams about building, owning, and believing. The sand hid Corral well, but in the end, the stones still stand, waiting for someone to listen, see, and remember. Corral today is considered a silent giant, a reminder that the roots of civilization run way deeper than we once thought. Between pyramids and plazas, ancient stones whisper a story that reshapes our understanding of humanity's journey, not one of conquest and bloodshed, but of harmony, craft, and hope. Long before mighty empires like Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Corral built extraordinary structures. They built pyramids without wheels. They mapped the stars with zero notes. They built a thriving society based on trade, music, rituals, and tech, leaving no trace of war on this patch of earth. In an era usually defined by conflict, Corral offers a fresh take on what civilization could be, a society that values connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It reminds us that complexity doesn't need violence. Greatness isn't measured by armies marching across battlefields, but by a community building, creating, and dreaming together. Corral's legacy stretches far beyond the dusty sands of the Supe Valley. It challenges old assumptions that civilization has just one cradle, that city life and grand architecture first belonged to the Old World. Corral proves the spirit of innovation and human aspiration popped up independently all over the planet, shaped by many hands, but driven by the same stubborn urge to endure, honor, and reach for the divine. Today, walking among Corral's weathered ruins, you can almost hear that buzz-pounding drums, whistling flutes, bargaining whispers. In the marketplace, kids laughing as they dart through stone alleys under a sky full of endless stars. Their lives, dreams, and stories still live with us, etched deep into the bones of the earth. Corral teaches us that even when civilizations crumble, their spirit can endure, buried under sand, waiting to be remembered, waiting to inspire once again. In humanity's grand timeline, Corral isn't just a relic of the past, but a beacon for the future, a reminder that even in the harshest deserts, beneath the thickest dunes, seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and build a world that reaches for the stars.